Mostly from a design side, I'm seeing the need for this new vision or a bigger picture or a new picture, but there's not like enough dialogue around what does it look like, or even from an Earthcare sort of perspective, how do we design a sustainable planet, ecologically or from an ecosystem's point of view, maybe even without the human footprint in it. And I'm just wondering if your travels around the world, if you're coming across any discussion like that.
This future is not something that we can actually design. It's something that will organically emerge, and our efforts to design it are part of that organic emergence. So there are places that have done some really bold, creative things, and who have, I think, maybe shown us part of what the future might look like. So, like, Amsterdam, where there are now more bikes than cars, or Denmark, or Iceland, Costa Rica, Bhutan, in some ways, is exploring this kind of thing. So there are places, but a cynic could look at any of these places and say, well, it's really being subsidized by the extractive context that it rests in, and it's embedded in the whole system, and so on and so forth. But I do think that there are places like that, that these ideas are being tried out on a larger scale. That said, they're all still marginal. Like, these countries are marginal countries. Permaculture is marginal to mainstream agriculture. Holistic healing, that's a whole other part of the picture. That's marginal. And really, I think that these things will stay marginal and on the periphery until the core melts down. And when it does, then they will come into that empty space. So the transition process, I've spoken of the old story and the new story. There's another part of the process called the space between stories. And a lot of us go through this personally. When the old falls apart, and it's really a sacred state that we don't have much room for in our culture. Other cultures might say, oh, time for you to go on a vision quest, time for you to go on a walkabout, time for you to go meditate in a cave. But our culture is like, here's some Prozac to get you back on the program. But I think the dominant culture is also approaching a space between stories. We're still holding on to the old, but the time is coming where we have to let go of it, and we already are starting to let go of it, and we're in this in-between space. We're rapidly approaching that, and that is the vacuum that draws in all of the things that were once marginal. So I think that the future will consist of all of the things that we've suppressed, marginalized cultures, marginalized parts of ourselves, marginalized technologies, and so on. Yeah.
I'm interested to know well, on the one hand, it's a question of scale. How does this change come about? Is it on an individual level? Is it sort of about everyday interpersonal interactions? Or is it something that has to be quite sort of grand? Are we talking about a social revolution?
Our theory of change, our understanding of what's practical and how to be effective, all of these are grounded in the old story. So often, even as we're trying to create change in the world, on a deeper level, we're just reinforcing the narratives that create the problems to begin with. So there comes a point where doing nothing is the best thing we can possibly do. And this happens again and again. We think we think that we've turned over a new leaf, and now instead of exploiting the unwashed masses, now we are improving their lot. Now instead of enslaving them, we're bringing them schools, and hospitals and factories and development. And then it turns out later on we realized that we were still operating from the same colonialistic paradigm. So I think that the space between stories is when we just give up for a while. We give up on that and kind of deprogram from our habitual ways of doing things. The metaphor I use is the Tower of Babel, which happily is a biblical metaphor. So, you know, here the Babylonians are trying to build a tower to heaven. And they exert, and I'll embroider the story a little bit, they exert tremendous effort, and they build the tower that high, and they climb up and they say, oh, darn it, we're not any closer to the sky. We're going to have to try harder. So they redouble their efforts, and they put all of their social resources into building this tower, and they build it twice as high, and they get to the top, and they say, darn it, we're still not any closer to the sky. The problem is that we're not building fast enough. So they try to build even faster. And now the foundation begins to crumble, even as they're building higher, and they have to devote more and more energy even to keep the thing at the same height. And that's kind of where we are right now. And then what happens? Finally, they give up. And they look around them, and having given up, they realize, gee, the sky actually begins an inch off the ground. We're already here. So by the same token, we already have all of the technology that we need to live in a really beautiful world. Like in South Africa, how much human attention, how much labor goes into just keeping you safe from each other? Like that, you know, that is a lot, right? And how much, you know, we talk about the benefits of modernity and how no one would want to give up their privileges and so forth. But really, like, do these privileges really make us happy? Where are the happiest people you've ever met? I found them in less modern places.
From my perspective, most people which are poor look at the privileged life and use that as an incentive to go and get more of what they need, like cars and all that type of stuff. And I want to know, how do we break away from that system when you're already in the perspective of a poor society?
Yeah. Yeah. So like this has to be taken in a bigger context. You know, why are these people poor? And what does poverty mean? One of my kind of heroes is a woman, Helena Norberg Hodge. She wrote a book called Ancient Futures. She lived in Ladakh, which is part of India, for several decades. And in the beginning, it was a society that lived in a very, very traditional way. They had very little money, but everybody lived in these beautiful 3-story white houses. The growing season was short because it's at very high elevation, 4,000 meters. But so in a 4-month growing season, they grew enough food for the whole year, spent the winters having celebrations and festivals and weddings and things like that, had enough surplus to make beer out of their grain, and even could obtain a little bit of money to buy things from far away. But mostly they were self-sufficient. And she asked somebody in one of these remote villages where all the houses were beautiful, she said, "Where are your poor people?" And he said, "Well, we don't have poor people." A decade later, she visited the same village, and the same man came to her and said, "You Westerners must help us, we're so poor." What happened? Well, one thing that happened is that these systems of mutual aid and the skills to live on the land were stripped away from them through the inroads of consumer culture. A road came in, consumer products came in, foreign media came in that said, your way of life is primitive, and you must rise above it. So there was kind of a change of perception. The children were going to school instead of learning traditional skills. They came to devalue their own culture. So part of the poverty was perceptual, but part of it was also very real, because their means of survival and thrival were taken away from them. So that's the context that many people, probably in South Africa too, are in. Like the old kind of wealth has been stripped away. And this goes back centuries here. You know, the good land was taken over. So once you put somebody in that condition of poverty, of course they're going to aspire to get out of it by whatever means are available, because there's no alternative. So one thing that I think is important is to open up the space of alternatives and to say that the development model offered by the example of the West, maybe that isn't the best development model. In fact, we in the West don't even think it's the best development model anymore, having fully explored it and found out that instead of a paradise, we find ourselves in hell. But you don't see that in the media. You see these kind of glamorized images of the Mercedes-Benz, and the, right? So there's just level after level after level of imperialism here. And how do we undo it? It's kind of like a tapestry. You pull on any thread and the whole thing unravels. So I think anything that can kind of re-empower, re-value aspects of the traditional culture, what's been taken away, could be valuable. When I was talking to the MPs today, I was really impressed, by their genuine caring for society and the enormity of the problems and the complexities that face them. They felt paralyzed, actually. So I don't want to say, oh, here's my simple solution. But I will conclude with a simple solution, which is simply to say that if the whole world is, and I think I began with this, if the whole world that we know is built on a story, then the unifying factor in all effective action is to change the story. And that can be changed on an individual level or on a political level. But we are storytelling creatures. And so to change the world, we change the story. Yeah, thank you.